So welcome to this thematic discussion. So it's the Theme 3 discussion. We had Theme 1 and Theme 2 discussion earlier this week. The first one was on cohabitation and governance, and the second one was on social and equity dimensions of climate change. And the third theme is on integrative strategy, realizing transformation through the successful implementation of climate policy. I think the key word here is transformation and implementation. I think that's really the key word of the team discussion here. Maybe just going back a bit. So about a year ago, maybe a bit less, Institut Rocher and Uranus proposed to the Institute to have their to organize the annual event of the Institute in Montreal in June. As some of you fully understand, I suppose, the things didn't go as planned, so we had to move the event. And instead of having a very nice face-to-face meeting, we tried to innovate by having this event with the current format that you have right there, in the sense of instead of having a 2-day forum with 8 hours on Zoom, we decided to split things in two. So there's a first portion that is starting this week up to next week, which is more some subgroup discussion along themes, and then that will lead us into a forum that is a half-a-day event on October 7th and 8th. So the themes were developed following the analysis of the result that the Institute sent a survey late last spring, and we analyzed the result of the survey, and we identified cross-cutting themes that would be relevant for both reduction of greenhouse gases, clean growth, and adaptation to climate change, in order to have more integrated discussion around the issue of and the policy questions of climate change. And so we're having the discussion today on the third theme, or we're starting the discussion on the third theme, on those integrative strategy to create transformation, to implement climate policy. Of course, the objective here is especially to find research questions for the Institute or for any partners of the Institute or collaborator of the Institute, in order to advance the fight against climate change. My next slide is a bit more housekeeping issues. So with respect to language, it is possible to intervene in the language of your choice, but there are no simultaneous translation. You may have noticed that the website is bilingual, both English and French. And in the breakout session, the last breakout session is always a bilingual session. So we took arrangement in order to be able to take notes, etc., in English and French. And the two first breaking group, depending on if we have 2 breaking groups or 3 breaking groups, it's possible to do things in English and French for the last one. So some general rules. We're using the Chatham House rules, in the sense that any citation will not be associated with specific names. It's more the group that is thinking, so we'll keep the ideas but not identify people. The schedule would be strictly enforced, of course. I think people are accustomed to this these days, but there's now an etiquette on how to use Zoom and how to make it as efficient as possible. So please raise hand if you want to ask a question. Don't hesitate to use the chat box to say things, even say things that you think are not necessarily relevant to say out loud, but you write it on the chat box, and we'll, of course, keep all of the chat box notes in there. Please keep your intervention as short as possible. Don't forget, there's an online discussion and an opportunity to add contribution for each of the teams. So even if today you're in Team 3, if you want to say stuff about Team 1, Team 2, please go on the site and contribute references, ideas, proposal of a research question, etc. Also, don't hesitate to acknowledge the First Nation territory, for example, that you're on it. And I discovered in the process a very nice website, native/land.ca, which actually helps you to identify on which territory you are in, considering that we're not all in Montreal. and we're all spread across Canada. So hereby, I recognize that I'm on the St. Lawrence Iroquoians and the Mohawk territory on the island of Montreal, actually in the neighborhood of Huntsic in Montreal, which is actually the name of an Indian that actually drawn in the river about 200 meters from my home here. And he was a very known person at the time, about 200 years ago. And he actually gave the name of our neighborhood on the island of Montreal. So don't hesitate to use the tool and to identify this at the beginning of any installation if you want to do so. So the agenda, so Dale is going to make welcoming remarks in a few, 1 or 2 minutes. The team presentation or discussion is going to be managed by Sarah Hastings-Simon from the University of Calgary. She'll present herself because I think she has actually 2 locations, as she was telling me before the event. And then initial thoughts are going to be provided by Éric Pineault from UQAM. So of course you received a framing document which included information on Team 3 and on the other teams. So Éric is going to react as provocative, but as constructive as possible in order to stimulate reaction from the group and of course stimulate the discussion in the breaking groups that are going to follow starting at 1 p.m. So right now we do have a schedule to have 3 working groups. I'll actually come back to this on the last slide. But what we may shrink it down to 2 groups depending, of the numbers of the people we are. So we want to have, not too small of groups, but not too big either. So we may go with 2, and I'll let maybe Louis also to tell me what he thinks about this when we're at that stage. At 10 minutes before the closing of the thematic discussion, we'll come back in the main room, not necessarily to report on what was discussed, maybe very briefly, but especially to remind everyone the process on continuing, because as my next slide is actually saying, so we do have breakout groups discussion. So there's 3 here that are anticipated. Maybe we'll do 2. We'll look during the next hour to see if it's better for 2 or 3. So we'll have the breakout group discussion. They will continue later next week. Those discussions, they're going to be key in developing and they're going to be funneled toward a last session on September 25th from noon to 2 p.m., where there's going to be a synthesis discussion, trying to synthesize all of the research question proposal that came out of the subgroup. We're also going to add the online contribution as much as possible to the synthesis discussion. And all of this is going to be worked afterwards also to feed the forum. I think it's on day 1 of the forum, October 7th, where there's going to be a presentation of all of what was discussed in the previous steps. So unless there's major questions, I would invite Dale to intervene at this time.
Merci, Alain, and thank you all. I know a lot of you, but not all of you. I'm Dale Bugen. I'm the Vice President of Research and Analysis at the Institute for Climate Choices. So again, thank you so much for participating in this process. It's so exciting to have bright, creative research minds from across the country, from all kinds of different disciplines, coming together to talk about where climate policy research should go next, both for the Institute, but also more broadly beyond the Institute. So a quick note about who we are, for those of you that don't know the Institute. The Canadian Institute for Climate Choices was launched publicly earlier this year. We are a fully independent arm's length agency, or arm's length organization, I should say, that is funded by federal government, but entirely independent, entirely nonpartisan. Our goals are to provide rigorous research and practical policy advice on climate change mitigation, on adaptation, and on clean growth to governments across the country at all levels and all orders. That's a big mandate. It's a complicated mandate, and it takes us right into the meat of today's conversation, which is about integrating different perspectives. And yes, that's across those three pillars, but it's also across different perspectives and different disciplines and different lenses at how we might think about barriers to actually getting real policy and real progress and real action and moving from the theoretical to the practical, which is absolutely in the mandate of the organization and absolutely where we want to go, to be helping Canada move towards a clean and a prosperous and a resilient future in the long term by taking concrete actions in the near term. So thank you again for being here. I'm in Ottawa on traditional Algonquin territory, but I love that you're all over the place and look forward to hearing from all of you today.
Thanks, Dale, for this great introduction and the description of CICC. Now I'll let Sarah move us towards the team discussion. So Sarah, if you can also introduce yourself, please.
Great. Hi, everybody. Sarah Hastings-Simon. I am, as Alan said, taking advantage of the ability to be non-local. So I sit in Calgary and have an affiliation with the policy school here. But my main affiliation is with the Colorado School of Mines and the Payne Institute for Public Policy there. So another resource-intensive region facing a lot of the same questions. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about both American and Canadian resource issues. And so I won't spend a lot of time. I think, Alan, you covered most of the pieces around the format that we have these 3 sessions for live exchange today, the one of the breakouts that's coming, and then the final synthesis section. Just as a reminder, there is this web platform in parallel where people can put longer thoughts and comments as we move into that, and that this framing document is only a starting point. So I'll give a little bit of a summary of the framing document as I understood it, and then turn things over to the initial thoughts that will come. So this theme 3 around integrative strategies and really realizing actual transformations through successful implementation of climate policy, I think for me is an interesting one, because I think I went through my own personal self-discovery, having originally been a physicist and very much living in the world of the only thing that matters is technology, to somebody who now works very much in these questions of behavioral finance and business barriers that really are becoming more and more almost the bigger barriers to making transformation happen. So the theme 3, I think, as it's laid out, is really pushing on that idea that we are sometimes overly focused on the technological questions, and that we really need to be thinking about the behavioral and the finance, and in that bucket I put sort of like the business questions, and where those barriers are. And then also, I think when we think about innovation, we often think about it only in the context of technological innovation, but that actually there's a lot of room for innovation in the business models, and innovation in approaches around behavioral science and behavioral economics that can also help to make that transformation happen. The other thing that I think that the theme document kind of starts to lay out is this idea that there's even really then 2 parts to the question. One is sort of how do you actually achieve or how do you get over these barriers in these additional areas, but then also how do you communicate to the broader public around what this climate policy is and why it makes sense. And I think one of the challenges that I see there is this idea that climate policy is often very multifaceted, in that, if you look at carbon pricing, for example, it actually can do many things. It can reduce emissions. It can also raise funds. And while that is, great from a policy tools perspective, because you can actually be achieving multiple goals with one tool, it can actually be very confusing, I think, for the broad public. And that confusion can lead to challenges in acceptance, because people start to feel like, well, is this about raising funds, or is it about reducing emissions? And you're trying to pull a fast one on me because you're trying to do multiple things at once. And I think we've seen that conversation play out. So, you know, in general, I think some of the questions that I think we'll get into, what that spoke to me in particular, are around this idea of then how do you overcome silos? So much of our, you know, government and policy making is very focused around tackling one challenge at a time, and yet here we have many of these interconnected, and so the need to really break down those silos to actually even implement the policy in the first place. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Éric, who will give some initial thoughts and a little bit of a hopefully push our thinking as the discussion initiator, and then we will have some Q&A before we leave for our breakout groups.
All right, well, thanks everyone for having me. I'll be doing the presentation in English, but of course, if you have questions in French, it's not a problem for me. Éric Pineault from Institut des sciences de l'environnement de l'UQAM, Université du Québec à Montréal. I mostly work in, I'm also attached to the sociology department. I work in political economy and ecological economics, and I've been lately done some work on the tar sands sector and more generally on energy transitions from an economic point of view. And in terms of territory, here I'm Sutton in the Appalachian Mountains, which puts me squarely into Abenaki territory. My partner is actually partly Abenaki descendants. That's where we should be, I guess, in some way. I have a PowerPoint that'll pop up at one point. It's not a very exciting one, but it just does the job of getting the words out there and visible. What I tried to do, I was asked by Normand and Alain to be provocative. I do also write on degrowth, so I guess that puts me squarely in one corner. And I also work very closely with the transition movement here in Quebec, which is very different from, I guess, what it is elsewhere in North America, because the Common Front for an Energy Transition is actually a group, a very widely based civil society organization that brings together, let's say, at one extreme, Extinction Rebellion, at the other extreme, David Suzuki, and somewhere in the middle, the Quebec Federation of Labor and all the other large trade union federations around this idea of a just transition. And we're trying to hammer out together a roadmap for a just transition for Quebec. We're actually finishing, I think about 15 minutes ago, the roadmap design that we worked on for the past 3 months has just been adopted by the coordinating committee. So I think we're moving towards the full adoption. So basically I kind of steep in these issues of exactly of the type of discussion that we're having today. So this issue of integrative strategies, the roadmap is actually an example of an integrated strategy, but it is built bottom up from civil society and organizations and citizen movements and labor movement up towards, so it's very different than, anyway, I can get back to that eventually in a discussion. So what I've done is my intervention, well, I'm gonna start sharing the screen a bit. It'll be there, and then I'll pop this up into this form. Sorry, I'm eating up all your screen. You can bring it down to a smaller size. So that's just basically, okay. These are I don't want to repeat these or read them, but these are the questions that I started from. I basically read them and read the framework and then started reflecting on these questions, and they're very close to the questions that are being asked in the wide community of people involved in energy transitions in North America, I would say. So I guess, yeah, it's very, some of them are more, I would say, spoke to me more than others, and I'll get back to them. You'll see that they come up in the PowerPoint that I've presented. These are the basic, 4 points that I want to make. So let's be provocative. Let's question some really basic preconceptions in this framework in a constructive way, obviously, but still. And then the second question is, linkages between technology, behavior, and finance, or as I understood also finance more widely as business. What are the theories that are out there? What are the ways of thinking of this? What is the reality of these linkages? Because we're here thinking we should link together these issues. Well, from a certain, let's say, social science perspective, these issues are already linked. So it's not as if it was a tabula rasa that we just step on and start designing things. There's actually linkages that are there that we have to work with and inside. So, and then how do we approach barriers to behavioral change? That's like a classic sociological, economic, and a psychological question. And I just want to propose maybe one way to look into it, but just one. And I think there's tons of other ways of looking into it. And then the last question, which I think is an underlying question, and it's question number 8 in the framework. Natural resources sector and its impact on climate change policy. And I think we should even narrow this down to the fossil fuel sector in Canada, which is a major actor politically and economically. And I think that we have to acknowledge that this is important. Alors, there we go. And here I'm trying to manipulate this the right way and get rid of, yeah, so see what all right. Well, the framework has some a prioris, and I wanted to question these preconceptions that I read in the framework from the perspective that I work in. And the idea is just to make sure that our box, because we're talking about future research, that our box isn't too small, that it's not too much of a jail that we lock ourselves into, and that we're open, we can open up our research agenda to wider questions. So I would say that I saw like not 4 problems, but 4 questions as I read the document, and I just want to highlight them. And I don't want to comment them for a very long time, but the first one is in ecological economics. It's kind of a standard thing. We call it the cornucopian bias, which the idea is that there's always a technology that exists out there that will save us from the problems that we encounter. It's just a question of waiting, of pouring the money in the right place, and then of convincing people to adopt it. What if there is not a technology that is out there that will save us from this or that? What if, just to give one example, we can't replace every fossil fuel-based joule with a joule from something clean? What if we're stuck with very big problems that cannot be resolved by tech, but imply changing the way we live, changing the way we understand what nature is and what society is? So I think that we should be open to that perspective and not fall into a trap that, well, there's this basic technological foundation, and then it's just a question of either pouring money into one side or pouring the technology into society on the other side. That's the first bias that I think we have to, and I give an example of a paper that questions this in a very important way. It's a recent paper done by some colleagues of mine in Europe that did an AROI analysis on the material requirements of all the scenarios that we have out there on a transition to global renewable energies, and they show the material constraints that are tied to these scenarios. The second is the engineering, or the engineer's bias, which is this bias that, well, we must, and I think it's already in the framework. I saw it, questioned in the framework, so I just want to highlight this question. We have tech, or we have to find the tech if we don't have the tech, and we have to either deploy the tech or find the tech through finance. And then finally, it's a question of behavior. We have to have policies that push people or nudge people into adopting the tech. And that's, that's what policy does. Policy basically finances either the initial research or finances deployment, and then it nudges people into adopting the solutions. And I think that from an engineering perspective, that's probably true, but from a political economic perspective, tech is caught up in a bunch of complicated business and cultural structures, and these impact what is deployed, what is researched. It even impacts the questions that we ask before we get into the tech. And thus, I think it's a much more complicated framework, and we have to have tools to be able to look into this. And that's actually my point number 2 that I'll get into in a few minutes. 3, I kept on seeing clean growth. I know that clean growth is a very important concept for the Canadian government. And I just want to highlight that clean growth is, of course, a rhetorical device really important in political discourse. From a climate science perspective, it is highly contestable. A lot of people think that you either get clean or growth, but you don't get both. That's a debate that's out there, and I would ask us as a research community to be able to question this concept and not to adopt it, and then to have this concept constrain us. There's a lot of research in ecological economics that says, well, either there's one or the other, but you can't have both. And to ask that question doesn't mean that we have to buy into the idea that, okay, you have to have either one or the other. It's just that sometimes it'll bring us to ask important questions for a given technological or even for a given social innovation. What are the Jevons or rebound effects that we have? So you answer one problem at one end and it generates by a multiplying effect problems at another end. What are the trade-offs for any given solution that we have? Are we trading off climate mitigation with biodiversity problems? Which could be, are we trading off climate solutions with social justice issues? That's something you discussed yesterday, either locally, nationally, or globally. We're buying ourselves out of our climate problems by pushing these problems towards lesser developed, lesser powerful countries. So the idea is that clean growth should not be seen as an obvious reality. It's something that must be questioned. And obviously, from my perspective, it's something that really does not, So carbon flight, telecoupling issues, macro disjunctures, or Jevons effects, rebound effects are typical ways where we can question this clean growth approach, and to avoid the growth prison. That we have to stay inside this growth imaginary to be able to find solutions. Maybe we can find other solutions, even though they're politically unpalatable and difficult politically to bring across. So remember that clean growth is a policy category. It's not a research category. Finally, the research horizon in which we situate our work. Is this research horizon how to act upon climate change in Canada, which is one way to frame our work, our collective work? Or is our research horizon how to act upon existing climate policies? And that's really an important aspect that we have to ask ourselves. I'm not saying it's an either or thing. I'm just saying that every time that we discuss, that we research, that we intervene on these issues, we should ask ourselves, what's our horizon? Climate change? And thus we might be brought to question certain climate policies, or no, we're situating ourselves inside a given, which is the existing climate policies, and we're trying to act upon them to implement them, to make sure that they work in the right direction, that they go towards the ends that they should be going. So that's some basic questions. Now maybe, oops, sorry, I pressed the wrong button. To move forward quickly, linkages are not something that exist a priori. That exist in a tabula rasa. I mean, it's not as if we're going to invent linkages. Linkages, and there's a bunch of research in environmental sciences, show that actually they exist, and they exist as power structures. So there's already a bunch of literature out there on linkages between technology, capital or finance, and behaviors. And there are multiple causalities between these issues. So it's not only a question of, how do we modify behavior through investment so that tech is adopted? Certain businesses, well, all businesses actually are always investing heavily in behavioral change. I mean, that's called advertisement, right? And then behavior has impact on technological innovation in the sense that, in a given business community, there will be certain directions that will be taken and certain directions that will be avoided. Capital, business strategy can be deployed so as to constrain technological innovation, to corner it so that it doesn't go in a certain direction. There's a bunch of historical examples on this. So we have to look at the linkages that exist between these structures. They're already at play. they already exist as objective entities that can be researched upon. That's the first thing. The second question is that there's power involved in these linkages. So there's a way, all actors do not have the same weight, and there are different interests and different strategies that are deployed inside these structures. And these interests and strategies are not all compatible. There is struggle, there is contradiction, but there is also complementarities, and there also are win-win situations. So we have to reflect on this not as something that we will create as a research community, but something in which we will enter. And what are the tools, concepts, categories, and science we need to enter into this space? And then third question, well, climate policy and climate research relates to these power structures. How do we, and how do we deal with that? And finally, and this is maybe more my thing, I asked the question, I don't want to move on quickly. So, social movements are also part of these structures. I'm participating in one example with this Common Front group. So there's one first bunch of ideas that I wanted to throw out. Barriers to adopting innovations, and somebody wrote, way up there in the chat, social innovation. Yeah, innovation in all the ways that we can understand it, be it social or technological. What are the barriers to change? Well, I often cite this very, in a few seconds, the Seto, Davis, Mitchell, and Stokes, Irwin et al. Study on carbon lock-in, which really tried to review all the research that was done. It goes back to 2016, but it's still very relevant. And just to open up maybe this box a bit, just to look into it a bit, but not for a long time, because I want to leave everybody space for discussion. Maybe two ideas. First of all, the complexity of lock-in mechanisms. Lock-in mechanisms can be ideational, so it's in the sphere of culture, in the sphere of our thinking. And they can be material. I mean, if you pour in, an infrastructure, if you create space in a certain way, if you make available energy in a certain form, in a certain space, then you lock in behaviors, you lock in opportunities, you lock in expectations. So lock-in must be looked always from this dual material and ideational. And both imply power and both imply time, material, and especially material lock-ins. I mean, infrastructure locks in for a very long time behaviors. And if these infrastructures are privately held assets, well, those that own these assets and that expect to have a return on these assets will defend with all their economic power the existence of these assets. Think pipelines, think bridges, think factories, think mines, think whatever. I mean, these are important material assets that will be defended with all, with tooth and nail by those that expect to make money off them. And then there's the lock-in structures. And these are very diverse, and I'll move on to the next scale. Well, social, cultural, political, economic, cognitive. This is taken from Seto, and it's just, you can go back and get the paper, and I can always send the paper around, but there are the ways they understand these different lock-in mechanisms and how they impact, and the interplay also between these forms of lock-in, and the way that certain actors are able to mobilize the lock-ins in their strategies, because that's maybe the before last aspect that I wanted to highlight on lock-ins, is that lock-ins can be a strategy that certain actors can use for change, or that certain actors can use to stop change, to resist against change. So lock-in is not a passive, it happens thing. Lock-ins can be produced through social practice and economic and political practices. And finally, on ideational lock-ins, I would just highlight maybe one last aspect, is this frontier or border between what can be imagined and what is unimaginable, and how lock-ins create this unimaginable idea. And I remember a discussion a long time ago, back in the 90s, around household appliances and this idea that, you know, we've been locked into the to the certainty that household appliances must be individually held, where it would have probably been much more efficient back in 1920 to decide that these would be collective things that would be managed in a very radically different way. And but that's not, you know, the road that we took. So we can't imagine sharing a fridge, whereas fridges probably would be much more efficient if there were these rooms that were anyway. So the unimaginable, that must be something that we must always be aware of. This idea of ideational lock-in. One last, and this is, I want to go quickly on this, but natural resource sector, that's question number 8. You know, how can technological, behavioral, and financial dimensions be integrated to address the challenges of national mitigation policies targeting the natural resources sector? This is a big question, a question that I work on a lot with the corporate mapping group in BC. The fossil fuel sector, which is, I guess, the elephant in the room on this issue, it's not a passive object. It's a growth coalition. They have strategies, they have money, they have a political relays, they have cultural relays, they have relays in the labor sector. So that's important to understand them as a growth coalition. There's a lot of interdependency between that sector and other sectors of the Canadian economy, and we have to be aware of that. And the fossil fuel sector is not a passive receptor of climate policy. They're actively engaged in climate policy, and everybody around the table here or around the Zoom knows this. But still, it's important to remind ourselves that, you know, the 3 big strategies that we've mapped out in our research is, well, denial and resistance is not passive, it's active. Unicorn farts is probably something that was reflected upon before being said. There's, you know, a bunch of marketing people that, you know, what's the word we have to find? Because Kenny is out there, you know, he's actively engaged in engendering resistance and denial. So denial is not something that I think it's planned. It's there's a lot of money being poured into denial. Accommodation and mitigation of impact, the Suncor strategy. You know, that's another way. We have these climate policies that are out there. Well, we try to mitigate their impact on our business plan, and we actively do it. And then aggressive redefinition, which is like the gas industry is a lot into this. You know, how can we redefine transition so that our business perspective can live on? And we do this aggressively through marketing, through. I think that when we look at this, and it's this getting back to this triangle that I was talking about. I'm going to quit sharing my screen, but it's getting back to this triangle that I was mentioning earlier on between finance or business, technology, and behavior. That we must not look at this as something that science creates. We must look at this as an objective entity that's out there in society that power structures act upon, and that we can act on also, and the social movements act on, labor movements, business, and governments. I guess that was my kickoff speech. So pass the word on.
Great, thank you, Eric. So I guess now we are supposed to, or we will move into a bit of Q&A in this group before we move into the breakout. I'm just double checking how much time we have for the first Q&A part so that I'm doing my job here. So at the hour, so we have about just over 15 minutes left. So there were some questions in the chat that came up. Again, just as a reminder, you can raise your hand in the and under your participant name, and I can call on people. But maybe one place to start, just pulling out a question, if there isn't another one that somebody wants to jump in with. So Dale, you mentioned the definition of clean growth metrics, and so I wonder if you wanted to comment more on how metrics apply to some of the questions that Éric raised, and what other ones might be missing if we want to look at this broader solution space.
Yeah, a little window into the Institute's research process. That report that's live tomorrow has been kind of steered by one of the expert and knowledge holder panels that kind of guide our work, and Sarah's sitting on that panel, so she's got a window into that process. And it was trying to tackle some of those questions that were coming up in the chat, trying to think about how do we broaden our frame of what we mean by the true set of benefits and the true set of costs that transcend maybe the traditional metrics. And does that broader definition that includes things like inclusivity and social aspects, that includes environmental and hard to quantify measures of things that still ultimately affect well-being, that include costs imposed on people and on the economy from climate change, does that big tent conversation around clean growth, is it useful? Is it practical? Does it provide a better North Star for kind of assessing policy options? And I think that's still an open question, but I think that's where the Institute has been going with our work so far.
Other questions, or Éric, if you have a response on that? Okay, so Chris Jennings has one. So maybe Éric, I'll let you respond and then turn it over to Chris.
Yeah, well, I think that it's a conversation and a discussion. In French, we tend to say discussion. It's more maybe a debate that we have to have. I think first of all, we have to redefine what we understand by open the box of growth, not take it as a given. It's a relatively, from let's say an economic history concept, it's pretty new. It's something that really imposes itself in the 60s, and it has in a very particular context. And we have to wonder, do we want to keep it, or do we want to move on to something else? And what does it mean when we talk about growth? Are we strictly speaking about GDP? Are we talking about material growth? Because underlying the growth question is a very important issue that any, I think, serious research on climate policy has to attack, which is the question of can we delink impact and GDP? So can we have this decoupling effect? And what does it mean to decouple? And what is, how do we measure decoupling? And that is really a challenging issue right now in ecological economics. Challenging because there's a lot of debate about the metrics that we're using to measure both ends of the problem. So the economic and the material or environmental end. And that really would be, I think, an exciting question to attack. When we talk about growth, what are we measuring in terms of and if there, if we're stating that there is decoupling, what does that mean?
Chris Jennings, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. I'm looking at the time, so this will be the very short version if I can make it as short as possible. I'm thinking about some of the things that you had, Éric, in the section on barriers, and particularly around lock-ins as an institutional strategy, something that reflects power structures. And I find that when we talk about adaptation, one of the places where we really need to apply that thinking and re-examine some of our assumptions, to go back to the beginning of your deck, is that adaptation is about protecting existing structures. The notion of adaptation as deliberate change driven by climate impacts, but the solutions or the choice of solutions depends on what does the overall end state of what those actions produce look like, is something that I think gets into a lot of the type of thinking that you're looking, that is much more about holistic understanding of not just the infrastructure benefits, but also the social, cultural, economic, and equity benefits. And I think, just to come back to one more quick point, and lying about being short, but to come back about the quick point, I think that also ties into the question of how we evaluate what clean growth is and getting off of GDP. I think it is part of looking at the economic benefits of how do we position Canada's economy to perform as well or better under a different climate reality. And that actually has a lot of opportunity to create some growth in areas where we do not currently have the kind of leadership that we have in the natural resource sectors, that could, I mean, scale is a question, but it will offset any of the losses we might have if we move off more high emitting industries.
Not really going to comment. I agree with, you know, I think it's just an ongoing conversation. I'd rather hear other people. I totally agree with Chris. It's, yeah.
So Chris Chopik had his hand raised.
Hi, everybody. Chris in Toronto, traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Huron-Wendat people and others. Okay, so for the generative idea aspect of our conversation, I think it's really important that we go wherever we need to go. I think that that if clean growth is the language that is accepted by people and understood, then we can frame whatever we come up with in the language that it will be understood by the folks we're trying to influence. I think we should maybe try for that. Go wherever we have to go, and then language to the marketplace that we're targeting.
I want to answer to that because at the Common Front, it was actually a very big challenge that we had because we had such a wide diversity of actors. How to create a roadmap for transition where we avoided words that would alienate part of the people that we were working with as a coalition, but also the people we were talking to. So we actually managed to avoid the word growth in the whole document and found a bunch of other words so that we would not be on one camp or the other, because, you know, you have the Quebec Federation of Labor, their #1 objective is to create jobs. As a trade union, they're really involved in economic development. So you can't say, you know, degrowth to them. So it was very interesting to see exactly to how, when you're in the interface, to avoid certain, but then the problem that comes up, and this is up to what point does that eventually limit your research work, and how do you work with that? You know, that to avoid that your research is constrained by the words that you're using to be able to keep on talking to the people that you're working with.
Great. So yeah, still looking for some other questions. Otherwise, I can raise a couple of my own. Happy to do that. I mean, I think that I'm really interested in you know, how we can. What are some of the research questions that we can ask, especially around this question of carbon lock-in, to get at some of the challenges that Canada faces? Because, you know, Eric, I think your comment early on about the idea that we're often looking for solutions within this box that's too small, I think that box is, you know, somewhat being created by people, you know, it's almost like a form of carbon lock-in to stay in the box. And so, but how do we, you know, what are the types of things that we can ask around, or the types of research questions that can actually help to put some, you know, framework or structure behind those ideas, and that then might lead us to solutions? So, you know, where are the research questions that could perhaps even lead us out of carbon lock-in, if I put the question that way? And, you know, Eric or anyone else who has thoughts on it, just please.
Yeah, sorry, I hit the wrong button. And well, that's what the Seto paper is interesting. It actually lays out a bunch of research questions at different levels, and tries to understand their interactions and tries to decompose the different dimensions of this lock-in. So I would say, you know, that's a good starting point to look into these issues. I would say that we need to have maybe a more sophisticated, or a sophisticated conceptual apparatus, so that we can take into account not only the existence of individual behavior, but the existence of organizational behavior, of institutional power, and then of different institutional interests in society. So that, you know, a state is not pursuing the same objectives as a business, and a business is not pursuing the same objectives, let's say, as an NGO or a social movement. So we have to be able to in our model of lock-in, take into account these different intentionalities, if you want, or modes of behavior. And then as I tried to show earlier on, the different modes of existence of lock-in. Is lock-in an ideational structure? Sorry, it's when the tonic accent moves, right? Or is it a material? And I think that one of the research, I work a lot with people out in Austria called the Social Ecology Institute, which are a bunch of anyway, ecological economists and people from the biophysical sciences that are working on social metabolism. And they're really interested in the stocks of artifacts, so infrastructures, and how they lock in durably. Because the lock-in effect of a given infrastructure is not only once you take that infrastructure away, but the lock-in effect is tied to the legacy that it's to take. The automobile has given us a way to organize space in Canada. Even if we electrify, even if we go towards mass transit, there's still the legacy of the way our cities are organized that is created by that period from the 1960s to today. So what are the lock-in effects today of certain climate policies that would actually prevent us from moving deeper into decarbonification? That's like one important question. And looking at this from a material and ideational perspective. If we're going to electrify, and it's a big question in Quebec, if we go towards just electrifying automobiles, aren't we locking in a certain mode of urban development and shifting our problem to Argentina, Peru, and Chile and Bolivia, the lithium triangle, finally. Shifting the cost of our transition to them. That's just a small example.
Great. So I see two hands, Dale and then John, and then I think soon we're probably getting to when we need to arrange ourselves into the breakout groups after those two.
Thanks, Sarah. So I like where Eric was going at the end there when he started to talk about specific examples and specific, more narrow frames. I think that's what we need from you today. I think that I don't want to spend all of the time we have debating frameworks, because I think that's not going to take us to the practical place or where we can go next in terms of delivering specific research projects and funding specific research projects if we're going those directions. So I encourage you all, especially in the breakouts, to make this as concrete and as specific as you can.
Thanks, Dale. John?
Yes, so I'm the one-dimension person. I'm only focused on the technology, so I don't think I will be making a greater contribution to this discussion. But I wonder, Eric talked about the fossil fuel sector. I wonder if in this discussion, and also for the objective of decarbonize and the clean growth, if we want to put those two words together, if we can change it to a hydrocarbon resource instead of fossil fuel sector, because that's a very different view look at this, right? And in the fossil fuel, you are essentially your fuel. This is the burning. You are burning. But a hydrocarbon resources, you actually can contribute to a clean growth or to other, to clean growth in general. Like if we're talking about, blue hydrogen, if we're talking about bitumen beyond combustion, making carbon fiber, activate the carbon, it can actually contribute to a decarbonized world, right? So I wonder if that will be helpful.
Yeah, John, I think that's a very interesting comment. And the idea that, of course, we still need to ground this discussion in the technologies themselves. So, if we are talking about how to break out of this lock-in, what are the pathways that are maybe available to the existing incumbents there? And
then related to that, always to be aware of the lock-in effects of these alternative developments, which must, I think, be pursued. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't pursue them, but always be aware in our policy design. To give one very small example, in Quebec, we are experimenting as elsewhere in Canada with what we call renewable natural gas alternatives, right? But one of the impacts of this experimentation is that we're extending the gas the gas transport infrastructure system. And that is tied to expansion of the importing of natural gas from out west, which is fracked gas, which is very different from, which is very non-renewable. So on the one hand, you've got this very innovative, interesting alternative, but on the other hand, its implementation is sucking into our energy mix more, let's say, less interesting forms of energy. So we always have to be aware of these important lock-in effects that are tied to technological innovations.
Yeah, and I guess that's another one, driving back to Dale's comment about specifics. So, being able to drive to sort of specify which of those pathways are sort of more lock-in-y and which are less. So I will turn it over to Alan, who will lead us through some instructions for making it into the breakout rooms where we can have some smaller discussions.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, for the great job. So at that point, in the usual format, I would probably walk around and say 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and we would create subgroups. But that's not gonna, it's not gonna happen that way. It's actually gonna be all automatic. You're automatically gonna be shipped into subgroups to have discussions, ongoing discussions with the first hour. And I really like the comment about from Dale. I think there is here kind of a challenge to discuss about some broad research questions. Like yesterday, we were basically redefining a new democratic system in order to create less inequity on the planet. But of course, that's big thinking, and we need a bit of that. But I think we also need some, some maybe shorter term research questions with positive momentum that's already happening there, but maybe not happening at the scale that's needed, because there are some still research question on policies in order to make this happen in a more efficient way in Canada. So I invite you to consider what Dale was saying. So I will let Alexander, who's with the Institut du Nouveau Monde and who's in charge of the logistic of things, and everyone is going to be shipped into subgroups. So I invite you to to discuss, exchange, maybe identify a person that can maybe very quickly summarize at the end of the hour when we come back together. Don't forget to present yourself, maybe do a round table, because we couldn't do it because of the number of people. So you could do it in a subgroup. And so I'll ask Alexander to create the subgroups now.
Okay.
Okay, so everybody is in their
subgroup except Alexandra, and Alexandra is gone, and Jeremy is gone. So we're the three.
Okay, Alain, je t'envoie.
Okay, so by the way, Sarah, you can go, well, depending on what you want. You can either jump in the two groups, or you can stick to only one group. And okay. Alexander is gonna, I guess, tell you how to do this.
That was my question. I don't know if I have to be made a co-host or something to be able to move.
Sorry, Alexander?
Oui.
Il n'y a pas un rapporteur dans chacun des trois groupes. Dans la présentation, là, la dernière slide, tu vois, Jason Dion, Ryan Ness puis Florian Pedroli doivent être dans trois groupes différents. Est-ce que les groupes sont séparés selon ce...
Mais Ryan n'est pas là.
Pardon?
Ryan n'est pas là.
OK, mais là, moi, j'ai pas Florian, par exemple, dans le groupe 3, ou dans là où j'étais. Ryan était là. Moi, j'ai vu le nom de Ryan dans la liste des participants, non?
Oui, il a accepté, mais il n'est pas là.
OK, ben là, il faudrait qu'il y ait... Assure-toi que Jason Dion, Florian Pedroli et Jeremy Morehouse sont dans trois groupes différents.
Mais là, on est-tu dans trois groupes ou deux groupes?
Trois.
OK, je pensais que tu avais dit deux à un moment.
Ben, non, c'est trois. On fait trois groupes.
OK.
Alexander, tu as créé trois groupes?
Ben, Alain vient me dire que je devais créer deux.
Ah, OK. Donc,
so I think most people are back, right? So can everyone hear me? Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Sarah, do you want to invite maybe the two groups to maybe briefly summarize? I'm not too sure if summarizing is possible and with all of the discussion that happened, but maybe to say a few words on the type of discussion there were in both groups.
Yeah, sounds good. Why don't we do that? Rebecca, do you want to start with your group? In the middle of my screen, so you're in the target.
Fabulous. So first, I'll start by thanking folks for the good discussions. We were quite a diverse group. I don't have a very succinct list here. I'll do my best, recognizing that I think we still have a little bit more work to do to get this to a reflective list of questions that respect the good dialogue that came to the table. So we definitely looked into financial stressors and potential best practices from business community. We had some discussions about the need to explore policy certainty, certainly as a challenging aspect for businesses. We looked into the urgency question and how to reframe these conversations about everything, but also behavior, technology, and finance in a way that is approachable to multitudes of audiences to draw people in. And last, mention lots of reframing conversations, but I'll also mention there was an ethics piece related to, again, a reframe in a way that draws folks into the conversation. So yeah, a very, still some work needed in terms of refining that list. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can go ahead for the other group. So lots of great discussion, hard to summarize it all concisely, obviously, but I'll give it a shot. So one area that we spent a bit of time on was this idea of decoupling and economic growth, and this notion that, you know, it's a measurement problem, that we might consider ourselves to be decoupling, but it's just because we're not tracking certain things that we ought to be, like macro environmental impacts, you know, moving beyond just GHG emissions to consider biodiversity and other types of environmental variables, and the need to be able to have this data in hand, as some other countries are working toward, to be able to do a richer picture around what decoupling might actually be going on. As part of that, consumption-based GHG accounting being another priority, to understand what the sort of global footprint of our consumption is, so that we're not necessarily just outsourcing our GHG emissions and patting ourselves on the back. So some interesting discussion on measurement and some practical things that could be done on that front. We also had some discussion around approaches to prompting behavioral change, ideas about how, you know, we can't just get trapped in this idea of making people feel guilty and responsible. You want to incentivize and inspire people to act, and that includes both on mitigation and adaptation. Being able to kind of channel and leverage the big swell of energy that's happening on the part of young people, and ways that you know, research that could go on that would maybe support that and provide some support on the education and mobilization side. But also this idea that a realistic picture of behavioral change and technology adoption is critical, that we can't just assume that, you know, where there's the right incentives, things will fall into a place. We need to look at the sort of real barriers that exist around, you know, early versus late adopters, risk perception, different risk tolerance levels. This stuff really matters. But also then this idea, this overarching idea that when it comes to behavioral change, we can't take politics out of the equation. That, you know, Canada's a federation, it's a country of regions. There are very different views within Canada about the way that this ought to happen, what the priorities should be. And these discussions about behavioral change always need to, you know, bake that in strongly. Also some interesting discussion of indicators for adaptation, you know, recognizing that there's maybe often this bias in some of these discussions to focus on mitigation, but that there should be and are in some cases concrete things that we can measure and look at on the adaptation front, that we ought to have on our dashboard, and really be setting some stringent and measurable short-term goals for what we want to be accomplishing on adaptation. And maybe even by extending responsibility for some of these beyond the kind of traditional Environment and Climate Change Canada role, to maybe pushing Health Canada, for example, to take a bigger role in these sorts of questions. So a few other topics as well, but I'll probably stop there. So yeah, lots of discussion. It'll be reflected in the notes. So looking forward to the next session where we can start to break this down a bit further.
Great, thank you. So I guess we're about to wrap up. I think I will remind folks about the next steps. So the two questions or issues that kind of came out from the discussions today should be posted to the web platform prior to the next session. But many more things than just those two can be posted, and please do go there and add additional thoughts.